Two sisters, two queens, two seemingly opposite destinies bound together by blood, by pain, and by the throne of England. One was branded by history as Bloody Mary, a symbol of severity, fierce loyalty to the Catholic Church, and the tragic portrait of a woman who loved far more than she was ever loved in return. The other, revered across the world as the Virgin Queen, became the longest reigning monarch of the Tudor era, an icon of light, culture, and soft power. Mary and Elizabeth, the two daughters of Henry VIII, not only had to fight to survive in a patriarchal society that deemed women too fragile, too emotional, and unfit to rule.
Young women who are queens is extraordinary. This is not an era of female rulers, and now we have two of them, and their kingdoms border each other.
They also had to face each other in a silent war between past and future, between faith and reason, between sisterhood and the inheritance of a crown. And yet, beneath those seemingly irreconcilable differences lay a complex bond, one woven with hurt, envy, inner turmoil, and above all, a reflection of the politics and prejudices of an entire era. In today's video, we delve into the toxic yet inescapable relationship between Mary I and Elizabeth I, two women who shaped England's fate through opposing choices, but together wrote the most tragic and powerful chapter of the Tudor royal legacy. And perhaps, to truly understand Elizabeth, we must first understand Mary.
If you want a good date, you're going to choose Mary every time. You're never going to choose Elizabeth.
Mary Tudor, later known by the infamous title Bloody Mary, was not born to instill fear. On the contrary, she was once a symbol of hope, the lone shining light amid a string of miscarriages, stillbirths, and overwhelming despair in the marriage of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon.
Your mother. My father never did anything so well as to cut off her head.
Your Majesty forgets, he was also my father.
Born on the 18th of February, 1516, in Greenwich, a land steeped in royal history, Mary was not the longed-for prince the court had hoped for, but she was living proof that the royal bloodline endured, and that England still had a legitimate heir on the horizon. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was far from an ordinary queen. The daughter of Queen Isabella of Castile, the warrior queen who conquered and unified Spain, Catherine was raised in the heart of battle. With an education as rigorous and profound as any European prince of her time, she passed down to Mary a fierce devotion to Roman Catholicism, the discipline of a Spanish noblewoman, and, above all, a deep sense of honor, dignity, and royal destiny. To Henry VIII, his daughter was a mere diplomatic pawn, a bargaining chip for international alliances. But Catherine raised Mary as a sovereign. The young princess didn't just learn embroidery and music. She was trained in Latin, Greek, political strategy, and theology. She was educated not to simply marry, but to rule.
Renowned for her charisma, for her charm. It was said that anyone who came within 10 feet of the Queen of Scots would fall in love with her. Now, I think Elizabeth had heard that, and she believed it, and she feared it. She didn't want to like Mary.
From the earliest age, Mary was a piece on the great chessboard of European diplomacy. At just 2 years old, she was betrothed to the French prince. Later, she was promised to various Habsburg royals. Yet every engagement was fragile, easily broken by the rapid currents of politics. With each new treaty, the king's daughter was negotiated, offered, and held up as a prize. But what Mary learned was not just the patience of a pawn, but the self-worth of someone who knew she held value. In 1525, when she was officially made Princess of Wales, she began learning how to govern. In her teenage years, she was entrusted with overseeing Wales in her father's name, a position of great political weight, never before given to a girl so young in Tudor history. Yet that glory was short-lived. 1525 also marked the quiet beginning of a looming tragedy. Her mother, Catherine, turned 40, and Henry began to lose hope of ever having a male heir with his first wife. Love turned to disappointment.
I know. I have the body of a weak and feeble woman.
And from there, the rejection began not only of Catherine, but of Mary herself. When Henry resolved to divorce Catherine in order to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary lost more than her status. She lost her father. She was stripped of her title as princess, banished from court, and forced to live as a bastard child, a wound that would cut deep into the heart of a girl, once raised as a future queen. From the radiant promise of hope, Mary fell into the shadows of abandonment. But it was in this darkness that her character was forged, resolute, unyielding, and fiercely loyal to the Catholic faith. These would become her sword and shield in the political battles that lay ahead through rebellion, and eventually, through coronation. And these very traits, though they would one day earn her the title Bloody Mary, were also the reason she never abandoned herself. If Mary was born into the arms of love, then Elizabeth came into the world amidst a storm of conflict, ambition, and spilled blood. She was born on the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, the very same place as Mary, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, the woman who shook all of Europe by pushing Henry VIII to break from the Pope in order to marry her.
Aragon was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor. She was a Spanish lady. She was deeply steeped.
Elizabeth's birth was the reward for a love that defied tradition, but it also marked the beginning of a chain of tragedies. Henry had sacrificed everything: the church, his alliances, and his reputation to have a wife who could give him a male heir. But instead, a daughter was born. Like Mary, Elizabeth was briefly the apple of her father's eye, until Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of adultery, treason,
that will sweep away your pride,
I too can command the wind, sir!
and incest. Elizabeth was just 3 years old. From princess, she was demoted to illegitimate child. Her mother was beheaded. Her father turned cold. She grew up without a mother, without protection, and without status. Yet, like Mary, Elizabeth was granted an exceptional education. She studied Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and possessed a phenomenal memory, raised by some of the brightest minds of the era. Elizabeth matured with the intellect of a scholar, versed in both the scriptures and statecraft, in the classics, and in cunning. Where Mary carried with her a fierce loyalty to Spanish Catholicism, Elizabeth was shaped by the spirit of reform a faith born from the very marital crisis that had brought her into being. At the time, Queen Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, was executed. Henry VIII had already turned his affections toward another woman, Jane Seymour. Just days after Anne's death, Jane became the king's third wife. It was during this period of turmoil that Mary, the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, finally surrendered. Still mourning her mother, Mary was desperate to regain her father's love, yet terrified of what he might do if she continued to defy him. Eventually, she signed a declaration recognizing Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively rejecting the Pope's authority. More than that, she acknowledged her parents' marriage as illegitimate and accepted her own status as a bastard. It was a humiliating blow that Mary would carry like a scar on her soul for the rest of her life. And yet, the reward for this submission was pitifully small. Mary was allowed to return to court, but her place in the line of succession was not restored. In fact, the new Act of Succession also stripped Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter of her princess title, stating that any child born to Jane Seymour would be Henry's rightful heir. In the autumn of 1537, Henry's long-awaited dream finally came true. Jane Seymour gave birth to a son, Prince Edward. For Henry, this was the pinnacle of personal triumph, a legitimate male heir, a prince to carry on the Tudor name. Hampton Court Palace rang with celebration. While Mary and Elizabeth were pushed into the shadows, the court now revolved entirely around the infant boy. Yet Edward began forming a cordial relationship with Jane Seymour, Henry's most beloved wife. A new Act of Succession had reinstated Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, though still labelled illegitimate. Yet first in line remained Edward, the son from a circle of powerful nobles who steered the court. Under their influence, England leaned heavily toward Protestantism. But Edward himself was no puppet king. He soon demonstrated a fervent commitment to the Protestant faith and a determination to uphold religious reform, portraying independent thinking and leadership ability, particularly in his later years. Still, Edward's reign brought little comfort to Mary and Elizabeth. Elizabeth went to live with Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife, and there, she was suspected of having endured inappropriate behavior from Parr's new husband, Thomas Seymour. Mary, on the other hand, repeatedly clashed with the court over religion. She rejected the new English language prayer books and insisted on maintaining traditional Catholic rites within her household. Tensions between the siblings escalated. Edward demanded Mary's obedience as king. She replied that he was merely her younger brother, and that she would never take orders from a child. Their conflict intensified to the point where, one Christmas, they argued so bitterly in front of the entire court that both were reduced to tears. They loved their country differently, worshipped differently, and could not find common ground. In early 1553, Edward fell gravely ill. On the 6th of July of that year, he died at the age of 15, but news of his death was kept secret. The Protestant nobility, fearful that Mary would restore Catholicism, began plotting a different succession. Edward had penned a device for the succession, excluding both Mary and Elizabeth, and naming Lady Jane Grey, his teenage cousin and daughter-in-law of the powerful Duke of Northumberland, as heir. Jane had never held power, but Edward believed she could preserve England's Protestant future. History, however, had other plans. From her estates in East Anglia, Mary swiftly rallied her supporters. Fueled by a deep conviction that God had chosen her to reclaim the throne and restore the Catholic faith. For the first time in her life, Mary was no longer passive. She acted, and she was ready to fight for the crown she believed was rightfully hers. Two half-sisters, two seemingly opposite destinies, yet fate would draw them back into the same frame, no longer children playing together, but two forces standing at opposite ends of a fractured dynasty. In 1553, Mary Tudor ascended the throne, and in the very moment she claimed the crown, the name Elizabeth became the greatest threat to it. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, Elizabeth not only carried royal blood, but also embodied the living symbol of the Protestant faith, the very faith Mary saw as heresy. To many at court, Elizabeth represented an alternative future, a different reign, a different England.
Mary's riding to court to see her brother, believing that, he's been unwell, he's now better, and she's been invited to court.
Elizabeth entered London, escorted by 1,000 mounted guards, dressed in resplendent blue and white, a procession that was both humble and defiant. She spoke few words, but her presence alone was a powerful declaration. She was still here, and she would not be easily erased. Tensions simmered until the Wyatt Rebellion erupted. Protestant sympathizers conspired to overthrow Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne. Although there was no direct evidence of her involvement, Elizabeth was arrested and imprisoned in the same tower room where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had awaited execution. Once again, history carved a wound that echoed the past. Mary could have signed the death warrant, but she hesitated. Perhaps it was Elizabeth's desperate plea for mercy. Perhaps it was fear of plunging the country into deeper division. Or perhaps, deep down, Mary understood. Elizabeth was not merely a rival, she was the last living thread of the Tudor legacy. Elizabeth was spared, but she would not forget. From that moment on, she began learning the most vital lesson in power. Survival does not depend on innocence, but on patience. Mary married Prince Philip of Spain, hoping to produce an heir and solidify Catholic rule in England. But that hope would prove to be a cruel illusion. The pregnancy announced to all of Europe never yielded a child. It was a phantom pregnancy, a public humiliation for a queen clinging to dreams of legacy. Philip abandoned Mary and returned to Spain. The people lost faith. The court's gaze slowly turned toward Hatfield, where Elizabeth lived in quiet vigilance, silent, but not alone. She was quietly gathering loyal supporters. From a woman who had narrowly escaped the executioner's blade, Elizabeth was now closer to the throne than ever before. While Mary found herself isolated, childless, husbandless, and increasingly unpopular, Elizabeth was becoming the very image of England's future. On the 17th of November, 1558, Mary, the first Catholic Queen of England, took her final breath at St. James's Palace. She died alone, without a husband, without a child, and without a direct successor who shared the faith she had defended with blood. Just hours later, at Hatfield House, Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. When the messenger arrived with the news, she is said to have knelt beneath an old oak tree and recited a verse from the Latin Bible. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." I.S. Elizabeth ascended the throne at the age of 25, young, unmarried, and inheriting a kingdom torn apart by years of religious strife. The court welcomed her as a breath of fresh air after the harshness of Mary's reign. Crowds cheered. The nation exhaled. A new era had officially begun. From the very start of her rule, Elizabeth signaled a clear departure from her sister's path. There would be no more religious burnings, no more terror in the name of faith. Instead, she chose the path of balance and prudence. Within her first year, Elizabeth re-established the Church of England along Protestant lines, but without fanaticism. She allowed Catholics who posed no threat to remain, and preserved familiar rituals to prevent national unrest. This new religious policy became known as the Elizabethan settlement, a masterstroke of politics that secured her throne while calming the thirst for vengeance on both sides. Elizabeth's succession was not just a transfer of power, it was a turning of the page. England, once a kingdom divided by belief, now entered a period of relative unity under a queen who had never married, never borne children, but carried an entire nation in her heart. The reign of Mary had come to an end, and from the ashes of executions, pleas for mercy, and a lifetime of isolation, Elizabeth rose, carrying the wisdom of one who had once been imprisoned in the Tower of London, and the resolve to ensure that history would not repeat itself. One reign had faded, a new one was born, and England, at last, had a new queen. They were daughters of the same king, Henry VIII, yet raised in entirely different worlds. One was brought up as a devout Catholic princess. The other came of age in a storm of Protestant reform and political suspicion. One longed for love and recognition. The other learned to survive through cool calculation and cautious silence. Mary and Elizabeth, two sisters, two queens, two legacies in stark contrast. Their relationship was never truly one of sisterhood. It was a volatile blend of blood and power, of personal wounds and political choices. They once shared moments of closeness, were both declared illegitimate, and both cherished their younger brother, Edward. Yet they also stood opposed on the battlefield of religion, ruled their kingdom in radically different ways, and left behind silent scars in each other's lives. Mary died alone, believing she had failed. Elizabeth ascended, became a legend, yet chose a path of solitude to protect her throne. Neither of them had children, and the Tudor bloodline ended with Elizabeth, a painful but fitting conclusion that the children of Henry VIII, bound by a legacy of power and loss, were ultimately unable to build families of their own. Perhaps the greatest legacy they left behind was not a dynasty, but a lesson. That power can divide even the most sacred of bonds, that in a royal court where the throne is everything, family affection, if it exists, will always come second to politics, and that sometimes the most tragic chapters of a dynasty are not written in war, but in the silent battles between those who share the same blood If you want to explore more royal secrets, hidden rivalries, and untold stories from behind the thrones of Europe, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss what history tried to bury.